Hello, everyone. How was your week? It was a bit cold, wasn't it? But comparing to the East Coast, we're thankful that our coldness is still tolerable. Tonight, I will continue to call on the Lord to protect each one of us and our family members, and that He will continue to bless us with love, joy, and peace as we seek His face and seek the treasure coming from His words. And may He guide us in this journey of life. We went through Genesis, right? The whole entire book of Genesis. And now we are at chapter 3 of Exodus. But before we continue, I'd like to share with you something that I just learned from David Esherick. And he is the director and speaker of the Light Bearer Ministry. This is what he said. He said, if you read through the book Genesis again, you'll notice the first 11 chapter is a preface of the Bible. A preface is an introduction to a book, and it reveals why the author wrote the book. And I just mentioned that the first 11 chapters of the Bible is the preface, and it introduced to us who created the world and how perfect it was when it was created, right? And then comes the fall and the flood and the Tower of Babel. In another word, the world was no longer the same, no longer the perfect world, because it had departed from God and fallen into a horrible, hopeless, sinful state. That was the preface. It kind of painted you the background. And then, when we're about to fall into despair and discouragement, it comes chapter 12. And chapter 12 is when God began to introduce His plan of redemption. He wants to redeem His people. And He made a promise to a person called Abraham. He said He will make him into a great nation, and all people on the earth will be blessed through him. But Exodus is still in the developing stage of this promise. We will slowly come to understand it more and more, because it is still in the unfolding stage. It's slowly unfolding God's plan of redemption for His people. Now let's go to verse 1 in chapter 3. Now Moses was keeping the flock of his father-in-law Jethro, the priest of Midian, and he led his flock to the west side of the wilderness and come to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. He looked, and behold, the bush was burning, yet it was not consumed. And Moses said, I will turn aside to see this great sight, why the bush is not burned. For 40 years, Moses lived as an obscure shepherd in the desert Midian. He was no longer a prince. He was only a shepherd who didn't even have his own sheep. He was taking care of his father-in-law's flocks. And we can see that his life is quite humble, a big difference from his previous life. Well, Moses brought the sheep to the west side of the wilderness and came upon Mount Horeb. Mount Horeb is actually Mount Sinai. And in a few months, he'll be back here again, but he'll be with over 2 million of people. What does Horeb mean? Horeb means desert or desolation. It is probably a description of the place. And what happened here? Moses saw something burning. Well, in a dry place like this, a desert, it is not unusual for bushes to burn, right? We in Los Angeles understand fire quite well. because we are also living in a desert place. Well, what was interesting and attracted Moses to take a closer look was the inflamed bush not being consumed. And that means it was not charred. And furthermore, there was an angel in the midst of it. Some people think burning bush is a symbol of God's people, that they are afflicted but not destroyed, because God is in the midst of them. So who was this angel of the Lord recorded here? Well, the angel of the Lord is not a created angel. He is the Lord Jesus himself. There's another passage that says something about the angel of the Lord. Do you remember in Genesis 16, 7-13? The story is about Hagar, who was the concubine of Abram. She ran away to the wilderness from her mistress Sarah because Sarah was treating her harshly. In the wilderness, the angel of the Lord was the pre-incarnated Jesus, spoke to her and told her to return to Sarah, and she should name her son Ishmael. You remember that? And that this angel of the Lord promised her that her offspring will be many, and they'll be too numerous to count. So again, this angel of the Lord here was Christ himself. Let's read on. When the Lord saw that, he turned aside to see. God called him out of the bush, "Moses, Moses." And he said, "Here I am." Then he said, "Do not come near. Take your sandals off of your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground." And he said, "I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." And Moses hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. So when the Lord saw that, he turned aside to see. See, God didn't shout to Moses from the burning bush. He waited until he had Moses' attention. That's interesting, isn't it? Often, God's word doesn't impress us the way that it might have because we don't give it our full attention. In this passage, he called out to Moses twice. "Moses, Moses." Do you notice that? The double calling denotes insistence and urgency. Do you remember another place in Genesis where God called out someone's name twice also? He called Abraham, Abraham, when Abraham was about to sacrifice his son Isaac. And then later on in the book of Samuel, God called a little child, "Samuel, Samuel," when God was about to groom him into a great leader. And then in New Testament, Jesus called out his disciple, "Simon, Simon." It was to warn Simon Peter that he was about to be attacked by Satan. And then Jesus called out to his friend, "Martha, Martha," when she was about to lose out on a precious learning opportunity. Through these examples, we get to understand when God has some serious matter to speak to his people, he called their name twice. So Moses was called twice, imply that God has something urgent and important to tell him. And then in this urgent message, God told Moses to do something. But before revealing this urgent message, God told Moses to do two things. God told him to not walk near the burning bush. Why? The place had become holy because God's presence was there. And the second thing he told him to do was to remove his shoes. It is to show reverence for God's presence. In God's presence, Moses needed to show an appropriate humility. So is removing sandals denotes humility? It is, because in those days, the poorest and also the servants are the one that usually goes barefooted. And moreover, removing shoes is also an indication of laying aside filth and pollution when coming into the presence of the Lord. So now, after this, God told Moses, he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Did Moses forget who God is? Probably not. But in connecting himself to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God was reminding Moses of his relationship with his forefathers. And moreover, in doing so, he wanted to draw Moses' attention to the fact that he is the same God and not the many gods that the Egyptians worship. And he is the same God that covenanted with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God wanted Moses to know that the covenant is still standing and it is still valid. And Moses responded as a mortal. He hid his face because he knew he was a sinful man and he was beholding God, who is holy. Let's read on. Then the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've heard their cry because of the taskmasters. I know their sufferings, and I have come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up out of that land to a good and broad land, a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites. And behold, the cry of the people of Israel has come to me, and I have also seen the oppression with which the Egyptians oppress them. Come, I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. God then goes on to explain the reason that he called Moses. He gave two fundamental reasons. Number one, that God has seen, heard, and reacted with concern to the suffering of his people at the hands of their Egyptian oppressors. God knows the pains of his people and has a deep concern for them. The second reason for calling Moses is that God has decided that it is time to act and announces that I have come down to deliver them and bring them into another land. For God to come down indicates a very special movement, an exceptional intervention of the Most High in human history. And Moses is the instrument. Can you see the love of God for man? And here, God described the destination is a good land, a good and spacious land, and it will be a place of prosperity, and there will be abundant room to raise flocks. It will also be an ideal environment that described as flowing with milk and honey, meaning that this land will have abundant supply of food. And then God gives his order, beginning with a strong command. Go. The command is precise, and there's no way around it. Moses is to confront Pharaoh. Bring my people. Let's read on, verse 11. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? He said, but I will be with you, and this shall be the sign for you that I have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God on this mountain. Moses replied to God, who am I? He's actually saying, am I really the right person? Well, Moses thinks he's not qualified for this assignment. Moses is different now. 40 years ago, he was very confident of himself. He was a prince of Egypt and a Hebrew, and he was aware that he would become God's chosen instrument to deliver Israel. Now, after 40 years of chasing sheep around the desert, Moses didn't have that same self-assured confidence that he had before. Moses was intimidated by the assignment. And then God answered him, "I will certainly be with you." God's reply is intended to take Moses' focus off of himself and on where it should be, on God. Therefore, God never answered Moses' question, "Who am I?" Instead, he reminded Moses, "I will certainly be with you." God gave a sign to Moses that God is with him. And what is the sign? The sign is God will meet Moses again in this same mountain, Mount Horeb or Mount Sinai. And then at that time, all God's people, over 2 million of them, will be with him. Verse 13. Then Moses said to God, "If I come to the people of Israel and say to them, 'The God of your father has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' what shall I say to them?" God said to Moses, "I am who I am." And he said, "Say this to the people of Israel, 'I am has sent me to you.'" It sounds like Moses didn't know how to introduce God to the people of Israel. That sounds strange, isn't it? Why was there a need to introduce God's name anyway? Didn't they know God's name? Well, in those days, when God revealed himself to men, it was often associated with a new revealed name or title of God. This often associated with what they were experiencing. Let me give you some examples. The first one is Abram. After defeated the king, Melchizedek blessed him. And he referred to God with the title, God Most High, bearing witness that he is the true God, the one who delivered Abram from his enemy. Another example. When Abram was 99, he encountered Almighty God, who renewed and expanded the covenant with him. And then, after Abram experienced with Abimelech, the Philistine king, he came to know the Lord as everlasting God. And then, after God provided a ram for Abram for sacrificing, we just now said that God, the Lord will provide, right? And then about another person, Hagar. Hagar, concubine of Abram, fled from her mistress Sarah. And she encountered God, and she gave him the title, "You are the God who sees." And Jacob encountered Esau, and he was afraid. And then God saw him through. And then he gave God the title, El Elohi Israel, Mighty One, God of Israel. And then Jacob arrived safely to Bethel after living in Upper Mesopotamia with his uncle for 20 years. And he gave the title El Bethel to God, meaning God of the house of God. And this is the place where he dreamed about God and the letter 20 years ago. All this were recorded in Genesis. Moses was anticipating a potential question asked by the Israelites. By what name did God reveal himself to you? What they meant was, if Moses claimed to be representative of God, it is logical that he has a title or name of the God that he is representing. And so God replied Moses. He said, "I am who I am." Well, it might seem funny to us, right? Referring "I am who I am" if someone asks of our name, right? But it is different here. It is revealing something important about God. Let me explain. Number one, it denotes that God has no equal. There's no equivalent for God but God. If you place God on the one side of your symbol of equation, there's nothing to put on the other side but himself. Secondary, this name, I am who I am, is connected with the name Yahweh. And Yahweh was not a new name, nor an unknown name. It appeared more than 160 times in the book of Genesis. Moses' mother's name was Jochebed, meaning Yahweh is my glory. Moses and Israel knew the name Yahweh very well. God did not give Moses a previous, unknown name of God, but the name they had known before. What it means is God is calling them back to the faith of the patriarch, their forefather, not to something new. Verse 15. God also said to Moses, say this to the people of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and thus I am to be remembered throughout all generations. Go and gather the elders of Israel together and say to them, the Lord, the God of your father, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and of Jacob, has appeared to me, saying, I have observed you and what has been done to you in Egypt. And I promise that I will bring you up out of the affliction of Egypt to the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, and Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, a land flowing with milk and honey. And they will listen to your voice, and you and the elders of Israel shall go to the king of Egypt and say to him, the Lord, the God of Hebrew, has met with us. And now, please let us go a 3 days journey into the wilderness, that we may sacrifice to the Lord our God. After 400 years in Egypt, Moses had the job of announcing to the Israelites that now was the time for them to go back to Canaan and to take the land God had promised to their fathers. What I just read is a long passage, and I'm going to unpack the verses into 3 parts. The first part, God said, this is my name forever. He's referring to the name that he had just mentioned. The Lord God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Yahweh, Elohim, emphasizing the eternal faithfulness of God to his covenant. Second part. And then they will listen to your voice. This was a precious promise to Moses. Why? Because 40 years before, when he was a prince and seemed as if he had everything going for him, but the people of Israel didn't accept him as their leader to deliver them. They rejected him. Surely he must be wondering why they would listen to him now when it seemed he had nothing going for him. But this time is different. God assured Moses that he is behind him. He is the real leader. He is present, and the people will listen to him. Third part. And then God gave Moses the instruction of what to say to the Pharaoh, to the king of Egypt, and you shall say to him, let us go 3 days journey into the wilderness. We know it was no 3 days journey, right? Why 3 days is mentioned here? Scholars said God presented a smaller request to Pharaoh first, so that the request would be more appealing and easier for him to accept. Now let's read verse 19. But I know that the king of Egypt will not let you go unless compelled by a mighty hand. So I will stretch out my hand and strike Egypt with all the wonders that I will do in it. After that, he will let you go. And I will give this people favor in the sight of the Egyptians. And when you go, you shall not go empty, but each woman shall ask of her neighbor, and any woman who lives in her house, for silver and gold jewelry, and for clothing. You shall put them on your sons and on your daughter. So you shall plunder the Egyptians. God said, I'm sure the king of Egypt will not let you go. Even only 3 days, Pharaoh would not allow them to leave. And God knew this from the very beginning. And so God promised he would arrange things not only to move Pharaoh's heart, but also to move the heart of the Egyptian people so that when Israel did depart, they would be showered with silver, gold, and clothing. And this fulfilled God's promise to Abraham that after Israel has served for 400 years, they would come out with great possessions. And this is recorded in Genesis chapter 15, verse 14. And then we read later that these gifts would eventually be used for the construction of the tabernacle. Few things I've learned from this chapter. Moses spent 40 years in Sinai desert as a shepherd. And most of us would say, what a waste of time for a talented and well-educated man to spend such a long time with sheep. But we know that he wasn't spending time with sheep alone. He was spending time with God. But those years were not wasted, because those years are precious learning experience. Moses would need his knowledge of the desert when the time comes for him to lead his people through it. And Moses also had much to unlearn. The influences that had surrounded him in Egypt, like the love of his adopted mother, the love of the luxurious life in the palace, the love of his own high position as the king's grandson, the influence of a false religion, the impressive ritual of idolatrous worship, the magnificence of architecture and sculpture, all of these had left deep impression on his developing mind and had molded to some extent his habits and his character. It is with time, change of surroundings, and communion with God could remove these impressions. It would require on the part of Moses himself a struggle to renounce error and accept truth from God. But we know that he's not doing all this alone by himself, because God would be his helper. The story also reveals to us something about our God. He is different from other gods. Number one, he is a personal God. Again, the term is used, your God. Number two, he is faithful. He keeps his promises. Number three, he is compassionate. He identifies with the suffering of his people. Number four, he is sovereign. He summons people and gives order. This is chapter 3 of Exodus. And next week, we'll study chapter 4. Happy Sabbath.